Today we're going through the settings of the newly released Call of Duty Vanguard, aiming to maximise our FPS whilst also maintaining a good level of game image quality, as well as keeping that visibility high. Now, I made a similar settings video for the Vanguard beta when that came out, and there were quite a few bugs with the actual graphics menu, and luckily, in this full release version of the game, that is all fixed, and we have a full settings menu to get our fingers dirty in. So without further ado, let's jump into the display area of the graphics tab and get started. Now, a key point for this video is that I'm actually going to be explaining every single setting I go through, and not only giving you what I recommend for just a majority of people, but also recommendations here and there for people who might have setups which are different from mine. I'm running an RTX 3070 in my PC at the moment, so obviously I'm able to push the game a little bit harder than some of you guys might be able to. So I'll be offering my opinion on certain settings that I think could be dialed back in certain ways or changed in certain ways to help you guys out as well. So let's begin with the first setting, display mode, which we want to have set to full screen. I've explained this in a lot of my settings videos. Full screen mode means that the game gets exclusivity kind of over your PC when it's running, when it's actually maximized. This is far better than in full screen borderless, where and this has been improved over the years, especially with Windows 10. But what full screen borderless will actually do is essentially overlay the game in a certain way over whatever you've got running in the background. If you happen to have another program running in the background, an internet browser is open or something like that, it's actually going to not only give that thing in the background more priority and give the game less exclusivity, but it's also going to affect your overall system latency and input latency. You might not feel it kind of on a game-to-game basis, but it's definitely there, and for the true smooth experience, you definitely want to give the game full exclusivity by playing on full screen. So let's select that. Display resolution, just leave it to auto. This should detect your native resolution, which for me is 1080p. If not, for any reason, then make sure you come in here and select that correctly. But for most people, auto is fine. Monitor, I don't have to explain. Obviously, make sure the game's coming out on the correct monitor. If it's coming out on the wrong one, you can change that here. Refresh rate, set this to just the refresh rate of the monitor. For me, that's 240 Hertz. Make sure that this is set up properly. You don't want this set lower than your refresh rate, because you're not giving you're not getting the most out of your monitor that you can. So make sure this is set properly. Auto should be fine. VSync gameplay and VSync menus. I would always recommend keeping VSync off unless you're trying to run some sort of a G-Sync setup. If you want to understand how to run a G-Sync setup, or you've got a G-Sync monitor, this isn't going to be the video for you. Well, I mean, all the other settings will make sense, but I'm not going to explain G-Sync here. For anyone who's not running G-Sync, keep VSync off, because all it really does is it increases input latency pretty heavily, just to mean that you don't get screen tearing, but I don't really get too much screen tearing anyway, especially with the refresh rate of my monitor being so high. Sorry, just slurring my words. Frame rate limit. I've got this set to custom, and then you can click show more and you can see the different frame rate limits. I would recommend that you just shove the gameplay custom frame rate limit on the max. Let me just apply that. And then menu custom frame rate limit, I keep this on 100 because I don't need this to be unlimited. If I'm sat on the menus, I don't need my PC chugging along, grinding out 300 frames. I can just have it sat at 100. It feels smoother than the default 60, I think it is, that it's set up to be. Setting up to 100 or even a little bit higher means the whole menu just feels a bit smoother. I'm not getting that jarring experience of going back and forth, so I would set it to somewhere around here. And then minimized, just set it to something low, because when you minimized out the game, you really don't need the game to be chugging along in your PC at all. It just can sit in the background, lower FPS, lower system resources. That makes the most sense. Aspect ratio, set this to automatic. This should set it, it's kind of similar to the display resolution. It should just set to the aspect ratio of your monitor. For me, it's 16:9, but if your game's looking a bit weird and stretched, then come in here and make sure you've got the correct aspect ratio selected for your monitor. Brightness. I always like to turn this up a little bit beyond what it tries to recommend. As you can see here where it says barely visible, it would probably say, I mean, the recording might not detect this, but it would say I probably should have this a bit lower, like around 40 or something like that. But I've always found that 55, just 5 above the default, just brightens up the image, gives a bit better visibility across the board for literally no cost in frames or anything like that. So this is kind of a personal preference thing. Maybe you like the game to be a bit darker and have a bit more contrast, but for me, I like to bring up some of those dark areas and really bump that visibility. Next up, last couple of things in this menu, display gamma, just set this to sRGB if you're on a monitor. If you're playing on a TV, which most PC players won't be, you can set this to BT1886, but you know, for most of us PC players on a monitor, set it to 2.2 sRGB. Slurring my words a lot today. Okay, HDR, keep this to off. It's not something we want to use for multiplayer. If you have a HDR setup and you want to use it for campaign, go ahead. But for those of you who want to just maximize your visibility for multiplayer, keep this off. Focus mode. This is a nice little new thing that the game has. You can turn this on, and what it will do is it puts a black overlay basically around different bits of the monitors to actually focus you in on what you're looking at. You can see here when the game is in focus, sets a black overlay around the game window to hide the rest of the screen, especially useful on widescreen monitors. Not something which is useful for me. I don't know if this has any effect on FPS or anything. I don't think it does, but we're going to leave it off because we don't want any weird lighting happening on different bits of the screen. We just want the game to be looking as clean as possible. Display adapter, make sure this is set to your graphics card. You shouldn't have any other options here, but if you somehow have maybe your Intel graphics in terms of on your CPU or something like that, make sure it hasn't accidentally selected that. Make sure you've got your actual AMD or NVIDIA graphics card selected. Restart shader compilation is a useful one-stop shop to basically fix any stuttering you get in the game. So come here if you have any problems. And also on-demand texture streaming, I've got this turned off. This was something I always have turned off when I was playing Warzone. It basically allows you to download high quality textures, and it means you can get really nice looking textures and stuff, but I don't play with crazy looking textures, and I don't really want things being downloaded onto my PC as I play or anything like that, so I've got this set to off. It doesn't really affect frames or anything unless you're really pushing some really high textures and you want to get that really nice quality. It's not really needed in my opinion. Next up, the quality area. So this is where we kind of start getting into the nitty gritty of bits. So starting off, quality presets, just set it to custom. That allows us to then go down and change things down here, which is what we're going to be doing in the video. Render resolution, leave this at 100. This is something which you can come back to later on if you really need an FPS boost. If you're playing on a really low end system, you can turn down the render resolution and just bump up that FPS pretty seamlessly, but it will blur your image quite a lot. So generally keep this at 100% for most people. Don't super sample by turning this beyond 100. It's not worth it. There's much better ways to sharpen up your image, as we'll get to in a bit. Dynamic resolution, I would keep this off. This is another thing which can be useful. Basically, it will adjust the render resolution as you go to maintain a certain frame rate target. So if you set this to 200 FPS and then you get into a situation where your FPS would drop below 200, it would drop your render resolution a little bit to keep the FPS high. Once again, something I would not recommend because I think it's even worse to have your render resolution turning to different values all the time. That doesn't sound very good, so keep that off. Next, in the details and textures section, starting off with texture resolution, I basically always set my textures at medium. You'll see the effect on VRAM is high, but really this is the most VRAM bound thing you can do for a game, is how high resolution are your textures. Now I've got a 3070 with a lot of VRAM in it, and therefore textures aren't really a problem for me. I could probably get away with running them at high, but I don't really see much visual improvement from medium to high. I definitely don't like being someone who runs around with very low textures because it does make the game look blurry on certain areas and really ugly to look at. But if you have a lower end system, put this to very low. Just shove it to very low because it will save you some FPS. For anyone else who's running kind of mid to high end systems, put it on medium, try out low, try out medium, see how much it really affects your FPS. You'll find for a lot of you guys, it doesn't affect it that much, and it makes your game look a hell of a lot better, improving that visibility as well. Texture filter anisotropic, bit of a weird name. This is basically anisotropic filtering. just put this to high, and isotropic filtering has never affected FPS really at all. Maybe 1 FPS here and there, and it definitely improves the detail of surfaces, no matter what you set your texture resolution as. So really good for visibility, really good for quality, and doesn't affect your FPS. So it's a lovely setting to keep high as possible. Similar thing goes for particle quality level. So there's particle quality level and particle resolution. I was a little bit confused in these, but I read up about them and found that putting the particle quality level to high and the particle resolution to low, it gives you the best balance of FPS and visibility. There's actually quite a lot of particles in this game, especially on some of the snowy maps. You've got snow kind of coming across the screen and stuff. So setting this to high and then low basically means that that doesn't take up as much system resource, and also allows you to just see through the clouds a little bit easier, giving you that slightly better visibility. Bullet impact and sprays, I like to keep these on. These aren't really going to affect much. Maybe it adds visual clutter that you don't want to see, so you might want to turn these off, but I've always liked being able to see where I've hit a wall. In my head, I feel like it's going to help me in some way. It probably doesn't, but I like to leave these on. Shader quality. These should be set to low. I didn't mean to have those on high. It's a lighting quality feature. Set the intensity of the lighting treatment on some surfaces. This has a slight impact on the colorization. Yeah, putting this to low or high doesn't seem to make too much difference. I tested this in a private match and didn't really change the lighting all that much. I didn't really see too much of a difference, so I've just put it on low to save the FPS. Tessellation, definitely put this to off. This can start to rank up a decent amount of FPS impact, adding, as you can see, subdivision to object and surfaces, increasing the kind of level of detail of certain edges of the ground and stuff. Not something that's going to be useful really in terms of getting better visibility, having this higher, so we just keep this on low, or sorry, off, to improve the FPS. Flying through these next few ones, these were all things that were kind of broke in the Vanguard beta, or beta, however you want to pronounce it, and these were the level of detail settings. So the nearby level of detail I've got set to low, distant level of detail low, clutter draw distance low as well. So I had to go with these, turn these up, turn these down. I saw a little bit of FPS increase, about 5 FPS or so on my system, which typically means that for lower end systems, you'd probably get an even bigger boost because, your GPU is gating you a lot more than mine is. And I really didn't see much change to the level of detail of objects. I don't even think that turning this level of detail down affects the level of detail of players. It just affects the level of detail of certain geometry of statues and buildings and stuff, which really doesn't matter, and it doesn't affect your visibility while gaining you a nice bit of FPS, so turn these all to low. Volumetric quality level, this is definitely an FPS hog. Do not turn this up. What this does is it sets the detail of things like fog and clouds. It's also a visibility killer having this high, because you're increasing how much of that kind of fog and mistiness actually can exist in the game. So turn this to low to improve visibility and gain FPS, a really important setting here. Shadow and lighting. Screen space shadows I've got set to off because they're just kind of minimal shadows that don't really make much difference to me, and yeah, a little bit of an FPS gain, not too much, but just shadows that you don't really need to see, don't really affect you. Shadow map resolution, I put this to medium, but once again, this is kind of similar to textures. This definitely affects FPS. You could get the best FPS possible by just shoving this on very low, but I hate very low shadows. I hate those blurry shadows that you see when you're running around the map. It really just feels horrible, so I always put my shadows on medium to give them a bit more sharpness. I actually think this can sometimes help with visibility, having those sharper shadows, more defined shadows. Maybe that's a load of bogus, and maybe you just think, I'm just going to shove them on the lowest. If you're on a lower end system, definitely do that. Put them on low. If you're not, try out low, try out medium. I wouldn't go above medium because you don't really gain anything from going to medium or to high or ultra for the shadow map resolution. Sun shadow cascades off. Cache sun shadows and cache spot shadows, you want both of these on, assuming that you have kind of a decent amount of RAM. I would say 8 gig, maybe 16 gig of VRAM, so not VRAM, just normal RAM or more. Put these to on, because what it will do is it will store certain kind of light shadows in your cache so that it can access them and speed up rendering of those frames in the future when it's needed. Really, really useful setting. It was very helpful in Warzone, and it seems to be very helpful. As you can see, the effect on the VRAM says it's very high. It just overall really helps the game run a lot smoother, a lot less hitching when you're trying to render in certain frames. Spot cache size, just put this to low because you don't need the kind of quality of those that cache to be all that good. You just want to store it so it's available and ready to use. Spot shadow quality to low, particle lighting to low. A lot of kind of superfluous settings that just are meant to improve lighting but don't really affect the game all that much, and if anything, just lower your visibility. Ambient occlusion, put this to off. This is actually quite a big FPS hog. It says the effect on VRAM is low, but ambient occlusion definitely uses a decent amount of FPS up, which we don't want it to, so keep this to off. Screen space reflection, keep that off as well. If you really can't handle the really flat look of the game that this gives you, which I think really helps out visibility, then you can put this to low if you think the game looks too boring without it, which some people genuinely think. They just think, wow, my game looks awful. I don't think that's the case, so I'm going to leave it to off, but yeah, potentially put it to low if you need a little bit more realism in your game. Post-processing effects, there's some really nice things in here. We've got NVIDIA DLSS and Fidelity Super Resolution 1.0. I'm actually just going to quickly turn off this setting so I can access these. If you have an NVIDIA card and you want to buff your FPS probably on a slightly lower end system, where you still have access to DLSS, then you can try putting this DLSS to quality with DLSS sharpness set to 100. It actually works pretty well in this game. What DLSS is it basically lowers the resolution of your game and then kind of upscales it using DLSS. So you get the FPS that you'd get from a lower resolution while still maintaining the sharpness and the look of the resolution you're aiming for. And setting this to quality actually works out pretty well. I've been running around and trying out, and I gain 10 to 15 FPS, but for me it still blurs the game too much, and it's not really worth for me. I would definitely recommend trying this out though, if you have the ability to use it, because you might find that it looks visually great for you and buffs your FPS by 20 or more. And yeah, so it's kind of up to you. Similar thing goes for Fidelity Super Resolution. This is basically the same thing, but it's the AMD version. You can actually still run this on an NVIDIA card. I've got an NVIDIA card and I can turn this on and do the same thing. It's got similar settings. I haven't really found either to be better than the other so far. Maybe there's some in-depth testing to be done here. If you'd like me to do a video testing these, then once again, let me know down in the comments and I will do so. But below both of those, we've got Fidelity FX CAS. And this is a sharpening technique, which is absolutely brilliant. I've got Fidelity FX CAS strength to 0.9. And what that does is really buff that sharpness. I will explain that there is only one anti-aliasing setting that we can set to, and that's SMAA T2X. There's Filmic as well, which is blurry as hell, but we will want to put it on normal SMAA T2X because it's far less blurry, with anti-aliasing quality set to medium, and then Filmic strength is locked on. We can't change that. But by putting Fidelity FX CAS on and turning up the strength of it, we gain a really nice sharp image with little to no jaggies going on, which is what the anti-aliasing does. These two work really well together. Doesn't use up much system resource and gives you a really clean image. I'm really liking this. I don't think this was in the beta, and it's making the game look so much better. Depth of field, definitely set to off. VRAM usage targets, if you are in a situation where you have a lot of hitching when you're running around, you can try and lower this. But for anyone who has a higher or kind of medium to higher end system, just chuck this on 90%. On slightly lower end systems, start off at 80. If you start hitching, turn it down until you get that stability in your game. But yeah, I'm running a 30-70, so 90% VRAM usage target, definitely. Lastly, let's apply that into the gameplay. color customization. You can come in here and you can turn on different colors. I haven't messed around with this yet. Doesn't affect FPS or visibility, so we won't cover it here. Field of view 110 is what I like. Some people might like 120. Whatever you do select for your field of view, I'd recommend turning it up beyond like 90 or whatever it tries to set out when the game starts. Definitely turn it up and, you know, gain that field of view, you know, really make use of the system. And then also make sure ADS field of view is set to affected. This is more of a gameplay thing, but it really reduces your visual recoil on your guns. And this has always been recommended in Modern Warfare, Cold War, Warzone. Just do it. A little bit of an extra tip because it's nothing to do with FPS, but it's in the menu, so may as well explain it. Camera movement, leave this to least. This will really, really help out visibility. When you're running around, you don't get as much camera movement. I really like that this is a setting. It's in here to help alleviate motion sickness, but I'd say every player should turn this down from the standard to 50% because you won't have your screen moving as much and you can actually focus on potentially an enemy that you're running at. Really nice little setting there. World motion blur and weapon motion blur, turn these both to off because we hate motion blur and it really, really affects visibility. Some people like motion blur. They think that it makes the game look realistic in some way. God no, turn them off, it's terrible. And lastly, NVIDIA Reflex Low Latency. We want this set to on plus boost if you are in a situation where you're CPU bound. Now, what does that mean? And how can you really test it? Well, I'm not going to go into the kind of individual ways to test it, but simply put, if you believe that your system has a very strong GPU and potentially a slightly older or not as strong CPU, then put this to on plus boost because it will give you the best latency possible. If you are in a situation where you are not CPU bound, potentially you have a really good CPU, maybe even a better CPU than you do a GPU, then just put this to on. The way that you can simply test this is you can basically run stress tests, potentially using the game or using a stress testing software, and you can check basically what gets pushed more, your CPU or your GPU, and that'll tell you whether you're GPU bound or CPU bound. I'm not going to go in depth into that, but yeah, simply put, if you've got a really good CPU, put this to on. If your CPU is kind of average, put it to on plus boost. If you want an answer simply for everyone, just put it to on plus boost, and it's going to help in whatever scenarios, assuming you've of course got an NVIDIA card. And there we go, guys. That is all of the settings for COD Vanguard. Hopefully you have enjoyed that and it's been informative for you. If it has, then be sure to subscribe down below and like for more videos coming very soon. Also, if you want to see more of my videos, here's one here. Why don't you click on it, go give it a watch and see if it's hopefully as good as this one.